So welcome everybody. Here we are in the Think Big, Start Small, Create, the last panel session of the last lot, let's say, of the conference, Museum Computer Network in Dallas. We are starting with our panel on museums and big data, measuring and evaluating trends. My name is Trilce Navarrete, and I'll make a small introduction on this subject, and then we'll have the presentation of Carlos Manjarrez and Simon Tanner. I have called for this panel because I was really curious to see sort of this big picture. And we call this panel the big data, but it's actually also about the big picture. My research is on, the history. Oh, wait a minute. I have to show you something. Yes. So let's see, I'm a researcher at various universities, and I just finished this brilliant overview of what has happened in digitization in museums in the Netherlands. I've mentioned some things at the European level and certainly at the international level, but the core is actually the Netherlands. And I chose the Netherlands because, well, I live there and it's a fantastic country, but also because actually it's a small country, has tremendous internet use, broadband at home everywhere, mobile phones, and so for museums working digitally, it's actually a really cool place. Let's see. Well, enough about me, but anyways, I'll be talking about some of the things on my research in a moment. After me, I'll introduce now Carlos Manjarrez. He works at the Information Library. Let's see. IMLS, Institute of Museums and Library Services, as Director of Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation. And I have invited Carlos because he works sort of on this big picture. He gets data from different institutions, different kinds of data, precisely for analysis, for implementing a national policy. Later also we'll hear Simon Tanner perspective. He is the Director of Digital Consulting Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. And I think Simon also brings, what the three of us actually have in common, which is the interest to measure what's the impact of our work on digital heritage. So that's real briefly. Let's see. I'd like to start by asking some questions. We've been digitizing in the museum field for about 50 years. Perhaps can I ask you, how many people know how many objects do you have in your institution? All right. What's your institution? And how many objects do you have? Denver Art Museum, 70,000 objects. All right. So the Natural History Museum in the Netherlands, they have 36 million objects? 37? You just gained 1 million extra? All right. 37? Oh, okay. Sorry, I got that number wrong. Who else was there? Yes.
92,000, Princeton University Art Museum.
92,000 objects, Princeton University Museum. Somebody else was it? Yes? Air and Space Museum, just over 60,000. 60,000. All right, that's excellent to hear. Pleasantly surprised, so many people know. Next question, do you know what percentage of your collections are digitized and available online? Yes.
Just roughly 30% are digital and available.
So 30% of your collections are digital and available online, roughly. Somebody else? Yes?
Just under 50%.
So the Princeton University just under 15? 50%, so almost half. Impressive, okay. Okay. Somebody else? You know what's your institutional budget and what's the percentage of your digitization or digital activities budget? Rough estimate? Really rough estimate? All right. And then perhaps the hardest question, of the people available here on this room, do you know if your project will be accessible in 5 years' time? You know for sure. Okay, how many people know for sure? All right. One person. All right. I know it's not a very crowded room, but still, okay. This is actually not surprising. There's been some statistical work going on in Europe, and the first exercise was in 2008. It was published in 2009. There's been 2 others. And the questions were similar. So what's the size of your collection? How much has it been digitized? How much has that cost? And therefore, how much would it cost to digitize what's left over? And then how would you ensure, or would you know, that your content or your digitized heritage is sustainable, unrestricted, and reliable for access in the future? As we can see here from the room, there's been some issues when gathering this data and putting together these statistics. Some of them have to do with, nobody raised questions here, I was very pleased, but the question of, okay, what do you mean by digitized collections? What do you mean by budget for digital activities? How do you mean, because exactly how do you count, or what are you counting? When I started this project on the statistics of digital heritage, I'm coming from a museum perspective, and I was surprised that archives count collections on meters. Of course, not surprising, but I was surprised. And for instance, film collections, audiovisual collections, they count per hour. And, you know, the statistical reports, they don't include monuments, because how do you count them? Do you count a building? Do you count the several sites? Do you count also all of the objects inside of one building, or of all of the sites? I mean, it just gets quite complicated. And so, because there has not been any agreement on that, archives are not yet on these statistics, but we'll get there. Another issue, I guess, on gathering this data has to do with the fact that institutions don't always gather this information. And so when you do your work, it's hard to differentiate what amount of your budget goes onto digital activities, because if institutions are doing it right, what happens with digital activities is that it permeates all of your core activities. And so you don't do digital activities, but you do education, and part of that goes digital, or you do acquisition, and part of that goes digital, or conservation, or communication, or any of the other core activities of museums. Another issue had to do with transparency. As I said, you know, I spent about 5 years doing this research on the Netherlands, and I thought I was pretty close to my case studies. I did 6 case studies. Well, here's a finger. And however, I was still not able to get their financial data. It's very sensitive, and sometimes it's just hard to come about. Anyways, what do we know about what's going on? So I'm going to show you some of the results from the last survey on the Enumerate project. The website is there. You can find the raw data and also the report on the website. So what you see is from all of the sectors, about 20% of collections have been digitized. What you see also is that museums, and particularly the art museums, have the highest percentage. And that's because they're generally image-based. So museums are really interested in digitizing with an image. This definition of digitization is a catalog entry with an image. Oh, sorry, before I forget, a comparison, our museums are also relatively smaller than natural history museums. On the example of the Natural History Museum in the Netherlands with 37 million objects, the Art History Museum in the Netherlands, the Rijksmuseum, has 1 million objects. So you also get a sense of, okay, 50% of your collection is digitized, but of what? How many objects? So it's a little bit different. When you ask the question, and this is specifically on museums, 600 museums, 658 museums answer, generally it's 2D collections that are digitized because technically it's much easier and therefore cheaper. Sheet music is actually one of the collections that is less represented online. And that's not only of museums, that's all of the collection, and for music lovers and upcoming singers, as yesterday we could see. That's certainly a pity that sheet music is not represented online. What else do we know on the annual expenditure? And this is again all of the collections. About 1,500 institutions responded. AV collections are one of the most expensive types of collections, so they throw all of the charts a little bit off. But if you don't count them, generally museums spend between 20 and 25,000 euros on digital activities per year. The numbers are the respondent number is so high because this was sort of figured out based on the staff in the institution, paid staff doing digital activities. When we ask more specifically, what's your budget, you see the figure dropping dramatically. Less than half of the institutions were able to respond, and the response was, yeah, maybe about 1% of our institutional budget goes into digital activities. Archives have a little bit more. They have almost a 3%, but in general, museums have about 1%. And then the last publication of collections. Oh no, there's another one. Publication of collections. Generally, collections are available, but not online. They're offline. And that you see on the top is about half of them. So if you go to the institution, generally you have access to most of the things that are digitized. However, if you go online, you see a little bit less. The upcoming favor is Wikipedia. Particularly in the Netherlands, there's been quite a bit of effort to get collections on the wiki comments and then from there get it posted on the various articles. There's enough support from the government that there's been some paid Wikipedians in residence. Maybe I'll come back to that. And then the last one here, how do you ensure that your collections are available in 5 years or more time? About a third of institutions are part of a national digital strategy. And that was sort of the way for us to measure if you are part of a national digital strategy, you could expect that you will tap in the knowledge or the infrastructure for sustainability, for sustainable access on your collections. National libraries are on the top. Archives are also, their museums. Our museums, I think they have one type of network. Natural history museums, they have a different type of network. And then you see that per sector, there's different networks that might assist the sustainability access, but it might not always be linked to the national strategies. With European and with these initiatives, that's governments are trying to align their standards, their collections, and their resources. Right. So why this interest to measure things and to evaluate? Perhaps can I ask here on the room, is anybody involved in the gathering of information for evaluation or for metrics or something like this? Yes. Okay. Perhaps yes. What kind of data do you gather and why?
We have a full research and evaluation department at our institution, so it ranges from data for specific exhibits and programs to institution-wide visitor services data to data on some of the national projects we run.
So what institution is this?
Museum of Science in Boston.
Museum of Science in Boston, so you have a whole research sort of department that ensures that all of the activities are monitored.
Not all of the activities.
Almost all of the activities. That sounds amazing. All right. All right. Another hand up. Was it somebody else? Yes.
I personally am involved in gathering information about email, as well as the DMA Friends program, which is all kinds of different types of data.
Yeah. So that's the Dallas Art Museum. I was talking at your presentation a couple of days ago, was it? And so data on members and on email and on relations. That's great. And I saw a couple of other hands, but let's see, are anybody able to say, well, besides these two, because I think your two examples do link back to the institution, but other people are gathering data that does link back to the institution, and then you are able to change activities based on the results of the data gathered? A little bit? Maybe? Some maybe shaking hands. Shaking heads. Okay, so maybe a little bit. All right. Well, that's great. It seems like at the European level, there are a lot more institutions actually gathering some form of information on what's going on with the digital activities. Apparently, at European level, almost half of the institutions have some form of data gather online. What's tricky on this is one thing is to gather the data, and another thing is to really do something about it. And for instance, some institutions were really unable to say what happens to their data. And so, web statistics, what kind of web statistics and why? And here I'd like to do a little step back and look at what has happened throughout the years. From my research on the Netherlands, I was able to find the first number from digital collections from 1983, and I found that 7% of collections were were registered digitally. So that's of a whole country, about 800 museums, about 7% of the collections were digitized. And that has changed. Throughout the years, you see that some things are across years, so how many museums and perhaps, how many computers, by now everybody has a computer. There's some things that jump throughout the years. So for instance, how many museums have a closed network? Yeah, that was interesting in 1995, but beyond that, who cares? Everybody is beyond that. So I expect that, as we go along, are making collections available and technology changing, then there'll be some metrics that stick, some metrics that don't stick, but some of the basic ones I think should remain. Yesterday I was also on another presentation where they say, okay, numbers we don't understand very well, show us lines. So here are some lines. Actually, it's the same table from before. So the first line, you see that museums are adopting computers. It goes, all right. And then you see a line that goes a little bit slower. That's museums adopting computers, but using it for collections. So even though computers were there, computers were not used for digitization of collections, but more for the administration activities. And then you have museums connected to the internet, but then again, a very slow line on museums publishing collections on the internet. So you see that the adoption of the technology goes all right, but then, the application for this collection side is a little bit slower just because it just takes, as we all know, it just takes quite a bit of time. And if I'm to look forward, maybe there's some other tools that might come up and that might enlighten us on what's going on. This is from the Open Data Initiative, some of the tools built for the Wikimedia Foundation labs, if I say this right. And this tool actually shows how many people have looked at a page in Wikipedia where some of the images from the museums are located. So I just pulled one from the Ethnographic Museum in Amsterdam, and you see a period of 51 months, one of the longest data sets that there are. They have about 13 million pages views only in 1 month. And I only pull one image that's from this on the English Wikipedia, on the Java article, and they have, a small million page views. This is completely other type of numbers if going back to their website, if you were to compare to their website. One of my favorite examples is the Amsterdam City Archive. They have collected data on their web statistics for over 10 years. And you see here a 400% visitor increase. And these are interesting just because if you see a lot of fluctuation, you can argue about this, the definitions change, the methods change, etc. But very important, you see that there's no cannibalization because a number of institutions are afraid that if they publish online, visitors won't come to see the real thing. And when you have these brilliant, long-term data sets, it shows people continue to come into the website. And if you compare that to on-site visitors, people continue to come to the archive. So just to close, what can we say about this? Looking at these long data sets or these results is beautiful. And it makes up for all of this, little data gathering. Data is very helpful when you're, for decision making, but I think the coming speakers will speak a little bit more on that. And then I guess just to, a lot has been done, but a lot still needs to be done. And one of the big questions is, do you expect, especially in Europe, do you expect governments, because they're paying about 80%, maybe a little bit maybe less, 80% of your overall budget? Do you expect them to gather data, or do you or are institutions going to be coming up with their own key performance indicators? And I will challenge institutions to think about that, because instead of waiting for the minister to say, okay, now you need to gather this information and report this to me, institutions should look, this is what we do, this is what's important for us, this is what we're gathering, and this is what explains and gives value to the wonderful work that we do. And so, to close on this introduction with the theme of the conference, think big, start small, and create these wonderful tools to visualize the work we do.
Okay, so I'll shift gears a little bit in the sense that the focus, the information that I'm gathering is really, wow, there's only one screw holding this in place.
I know.
And, yeah. And so I work at the Institute of Museums and Library Services. I do not work in the grant program offices. I work in a relatively new office at IMLS called the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, just a few years old. And my background is in planning, urban planning, and I have an interest in organizational theory and organizational ecology. And I'm fascinated by the conversations about content and linking content. But one of the things that I've been charged with at IMLS is gathering more information about the institutions themselves. So IMLS, unlike NEA or NEH, which are discipline-focused, IMLS, written right into its legislation, is a responsibility to build capacity among libraries and museums across the United States. So there's an institutional focus built right into the agency's legislation. And so when I started at IMLS, so that was just a little background on IMLS, but when I started at IMLS just a few years back, there was a big event that happened, a recession. Some of you might have experienced it. And during that recession, there was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was rolling out just as I was starting at IMLS. And there was an amendment to that piece of legislation that highlighted, for at least one legislator, his feelings about museums and their role with respect to the recovery. And I've put that up here so that people could get a sense of the ways in which zoos and museums had been clustered together with golf courses, swimming pools, theaters, highway beautification projects, and parks. Of course, and casinos. And this piece of legislation passed, by the way, this amendment. And I raised that not to say that it was good or bad. That's not my place. But I wanted to raise it because this was a legislator identifying the museum sector in a way that the museum sector hadn't really been identified before. Thinking about the museum sector as an entity that was like these other entities and basically not among the deserving target entities for ARRA. Well, I was a new policy analyst in the cultural sector. My background is in housing and community development. So the first thing I thought to do was to look at what the policy implications of zeroing out museums in ARRA. Easy, right? You gather a database of institutions that would theoretically be eligible, and you start to look at those distribution of those institutions spatially in congressional districts across the United States. But lo and behold, no such data set of museums existed. And despite the fact that my own home institution and AAM and a number of other entities listed the fact that there were 17,500 museums across the United States, there was no data set that I could turn to see what the spatial distribution was, what their size was, et cetera. So in a way, I was sort of caught flat-footed right at the beginning of my job as a cultural researcher within the IMLS. Bit of a problem. So the good news is that I had a job, and there was, at the start of recession, that's a big deal. And the other good news is that IMLS's appropriation, its authorization, had broadened to include a statistical program. And those of you who are familiar with statistical programs in the United States know that it is a radically decentralized statistical system. Unlike Statistics Canada, unlike national statistics in UK, there are 129 different statistical agencies and programs across the federal government, right? And how many people can guess how many cultural agencies have a statistical program? Take a wild guess. How many? 4? Name them. There's one. IMLS. NEA does not have a recognized statistical program within the Blue Book. NEA collects data, but it's not a recognized statistical program. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal because there's an imprimatur of the statistical programs, that there's a charge baked right into your legislation to gather data. And so while there are, most people think of census basically as the statistical agency of the US, of the federal government, there are many more, and I'm happy to say, again, because I'm gainfully employed, that the Institute of Museums and Library Services has a statistical program recognized in the Blue Book. Well, there's a charge that comes with that, and that's reporting on a regular basis about the conduct and the health of libraries and museums across the United States. When I started, there were only 2 surveys that we had adopted over from the Department of Education. The Public Library Survey, which had been going on for 22 years, and the State Library Agency Survey. Most of my colleagues in the federal statistical system sort of look at me like this when I tell them that there is a cultural program that's gathering statistical data within the system. They kind of like, huh? And, but the nice thing about catching them off guard is that we can make data available across the federal government that they never anticipated, they didn't know was available, first of all, that they find reliable because it's within the federal statistical system, and that there's open access to because it is public data that's gathered by the federal government made available. So we did a number of things when we started with the program. First of all, we needed to transition these public library surveys and the state library agency surveys. These were sleepy little data collection efforts that were going on at the Department of Education. We basically, because frankly, they were a very, very tiny little collection from the National Center for Education Statistics perspective. For us, they were one of our largest contracts. And so that's the top one. That's over 16,000 observations a year. We have the highest response rate out of any federal statistical survey. It's a 98% response rate, item response rate for public libraries. And basically, we've been leveraging that data to start conversations with federal partners across government. At the height of the recession, when we did have this public library data available, the first thing I did was I geocoded the data, and we walked over to folks at the Department of Labor, and we said, hey, we've got this data on public libraries and the accessibility of public libraries in high unemployment communities. And then I got this look. Huh? The federal government collects data on public libraries? And so I said, yeah. And not only that, but it's geocoded. You can pull it right into the Employment and Training Administration service locator for people who are looking for employment support. We already knew that there were a lot of people looking for employment service support in libraries. We knew that from our stakeholders. And I also happen to know that there's only 1,800 one-stop employment training centers across the country. So when you compare the 1,800 one-stop centers to the 16,000 public libraries across the country, I knew without even doing the analysis that libraries were going to have a much more comprehensive spatial distribution than the one-stop centers that were funded by the Department of Labor could ever dream of having. And so we've done a number of things. We have a new data portal. We're going to be pushing data out, not just in flat files, but also APIs and some tools that your average user can use, can access to chart and to map data. But when I came to IMLS, one of the first things folks in the museum community asked us to do was to start a data collection effort just like the Public Library Survey. Well, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the structure of the museum community in the United States when compared to the public library community. First of all, within every state in the United States, there's a state library agency. It's part of the legislation of every state that they have a state library agency and that they have a direct relationship with IMLS through the Formula Grant Program. I'm sure all of you are aware that not every state museum, there's not a state museum association in every state. And in fact, I think there are only 2 states that have a state museum association affiliated in state government. So it's a completely different structure in that sense. You don't have the institutional isomorphism in the museum community that you do in the library community. You've got incredible, rich array of different types of institutions. And sometimes, institutions within the same town don't really do too much coordination. From a data gathering perspective, that's sort of a nightmare, right? It meant that IMLS and my 4 or 5 staff needed to build basically an information architecture, a data gathering architecture for museums across the United States, the number of which was unknown. We really didn't know how many there were. Not only that, but in the US, as you all know, there are nonprofit entities. There are municipal museums. There are state museums. There are private for-profit museums. There are corporate museums. What am I missing? I'm sure I'm missing some. Hybrids, unaffiliated, So, when I started to think about, well, how can I tap into information on the back end and gather data from other sources? There was just a few sources that we could think of. And those sources had a couple problems. First of all, some of them were proprietary. And second of all, they weren't necessarily comprehensive. And so while there are some folks out there who are gathering information about the museum sector, they may be doing so in order to, for reference purposes, to sell, access to the list, or they're just not there yet in terms of being able to cover the sector. So the approach we took, given our resources, given time, was to just frankly ingest as much information as we could from as many different sources that we could access at a reasonable cost or free. And that meant gathering data from private foundations. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Foundation Center. The Foundation Center is basically a data aggregator for private foundations, the top 1,000 private foundations in the country. And they document all grants above $10,000. And so I identified all grants that went to museums for the last 10 years from private foundations, and I pulled in all of those entities. For nonprofit entities, I went over to colleagues in the Department of Treasury, and we gathered data for all nonprofit museums that filed 990 tax forms. That was a huge chunk of the museum sector in the US. Not comprehensive, though. Obviously, our own data, IMLS's data, NEA, NSF, NEH. We went to our federal partners who are doing grant making to other to museums, and we gathered their data. And then because we were a little nervous that we weren't going to have enough information beyond these nonprofit entities, we looked to social media aggregators. One in particular was really helpful, Factual, which is an aggregator that basically works on the back end with Yelp and Foursquare, and they have this kind of continual data loop where they basically sell information to Yelp and Foursquare, but when anybody checks in, for example, at a museum that is not on Foursquare or Yelp, and then they supply that information to Foursquare or Yelp, that information goes back to Factual. So in fact, that source of data, 40,000 records, was only about $4,000. By comparison, IMLS, an annual survey of 16,000 libraries that IMLS gathers with our partners at Census is about 750,000. So I've paid $750,000. You paid $750,000 for 16,000 library records last year, but you also got a great deal on 40,000 museum records through social media data aggregators. I'm obviously working on the census number, and we're driving that one down. So don't worry about your tax dollars. Yeah.
Just a question: when you say 40,000, can you give me an idea about the size of this museum?
Well, that's the
smallest size, because I'm looking to understand what is the population of museums in the U.S. How many museums?
That's where I'm going. You're about to kill my punchline, my friend.
No, I'm sorry. Okay.
So altogether, this was about 78,000 records. 78,000 records from at least four different sources, which we had to deduplicate using a number of different procedures, messy procedures, name, geolocation, address. Of course, there was no nice, neat, unique identifier that we could use as a crosswalk for all of them. And we did, and we came to about 35,144 records. And this is inclusive of his art museums, arboretum, botanical gardens, history museums, science, zoos, aquaria. Now, I'm putting a quotation mark around the 35,144 entities because we're still working on that file. That file includes many, many different types of entities, and I'm learning a lot about the museum sector just by looking at that file. And the reason being is that you've got foundations that are the legal entity that are overseeing a museum, or that are the legal name of the entity. You've got one fiduciary that's overseeing multiple historic houses, for example. You've got legal nonprofit museums that are not operating historic sites within the United States. I cannot even begin to tell you how many variations there are in terms of the legal authority and the associations among the institutions. In fact, it's something that from some quarters of the museum sector I've gotten a little heat about. I'll give you one example. I've got the Friends of the National Zoo in there, along with the National Zoo. Why, pray tell, would I have both of those entities in that data file? Well, the Friends of the National Zoo happens to be a $14 million organization that runs all of the educational programs for the National Zoo. So for an economic analysis of what's going on in the museum sector within the District of Columbia, it would be foolish to kick out FONS, the Friends of the National Zoo. For an analysis of who's doing educational programming for youth, it would be foolish to kick out the Friends of the National Zoo. If I'm doing an analysis of the governance structure, it actually is still useful to have those two entities in there as well, right? Because you could see it as sort of a parent-child relationship between the National Zoo and the Friends of the National Zoo. So we're at the first, kind of the earliest stages of looking at this data file. We have the number of entities. We obviously have their spatial location, so we can look at the distribution across states, and this is the top 10 and the bottom 10. in terms of the sheer number of institutions. Yes?
Do you have this normalized to the population?
Yeah, I actually didn't put that in the slide, but we do on our site, we have it. So we do an estimate per 100,000 residents. And so it's funny because I swapped out that one, which is a map, for this one. Pardon me?
I took one of your punches.
No, my friend, this is your second. Second time. But since they're geocoded at the point level too, you know, we've uploaded them into CartoDB, and we're starting to look at the distribution of them in relation to IMLS giving. So this is a static map, but from Carto, where we're basically looked at the distribution of the grantees from the Native American, Native Hawaiian Museum Grant Program. And that the varying purple dots are those grantees with the varying size based on grant size. And then those orange areas are polygons identifying recognized tribal areas. But now with this Museum Universe data file, which a resource we didn't have before, we can burrow down into those polygons and look at the distribution of entities that have not ever applied to IMLS for support in the Native American program that could be eligible. We could look at entities that might, for example, partner with our current grantees, provide capacity building support for Native American grantees. And this is something that, frankly, we can do over and over and over again with different policy areas. And I don't know why I didn't actually include any of the indicators in this one. But whether it's child poverty, whether it's, you know, population density, whether we're talking about, you know, you name the policy area, there's a spatial element to it, and we can overlay our entities with these indicators. And so that's the easy part, quite honestly. That's the part that takes a couple weeks to pull down all the indicators and to do that spatial analysis. The harder part, and quite frankly, the big payoff, and this is where the big data part of the conversation goes, because 35,000 records ain't big data, as you all know, is identifying a way to link the institutional records to the content, right? And, you know, actually there's another way, another payoff for us is being able to grab the social media data associated with these institutions, right? And to look at the way in which these institutions are linked with one another, whether it's via Twitter, you know, these institutions, you know, happy to say that the network clustering of U.S. institutions is obviously pretty intense. This is obviously one Twitter scrape, one point in time. But this tells us a lot about the relationships and the interrelationship of the museum sector in the United States. But as I said, what we're really looking forward to is really having those persistent IDs, and we've talked to colleagues here, and that's actually part of the reason why we're here, is to talk to people to really figure out the best and the most efficient ways for these institutional IDs to really connect with so many other people who are worrying about linked content. Because from our perspective, we really think it's important to have that hierarchical relationship between the organizations and the content that they're making available. Because you can make a much more fulsome analysis of the impact of the sector. And quite frankly, from a public policy perspective, and when you're thinking about funding and supporting, you're not thinking about funding and supporting, you know, the websites or this really cool linked content. You're thinking about funding organizations. You're thinking about funding institutions. And how these institutions relate to the content that's being made available is crucially important when you're on the Hill. And so we're making just baby steps right now to make the institutional data available, but the long-term payoff is really linking that institutional data to the content. The last thing I'll say is that we're starting to have conversations with other agencies and also private entities about the museum data. Colleagues at the Department of Housing and Urban Development wanting to create better, more comprehensive livability indices are interested in the library and the museum data. Again, they're looking at federal colleagues who are providing data that they feel is reliable, and they're interested in ingesting that data. We're talking to folks, there are Zillow and other private entities that are interested in aggregating and putting in data about resources in communities where there's housing sales, for example, correlating the relationship between those sorts of services and housing price value. So while we're really looking forward to the day of having a lot more information, both in terms of the content and also the services they provide, we can see that the institutional records are really starting to take on and have a life of their own. I've probably gone on too long, so I'm going to stop right now and let my colleagues talk, and I'm happy to take some questions after.
So I'm going to talk to you about value and impact for museums, and what I'm trying to do to a certain extent is provide you with a way of thinking about what you can do in response to the previous two speakers, what you've heard from Trilce and Carlos. I mean, Carlos has made it pretty clear, the government isn't going to gather this data for you. They are not going to make your case that you are a valuable or impactful institution for you. You've got to do that yourself. You've got to find ways in which you can demonstrate that. But you may also want to know, particularly for digital resources, how you're having an effect with those digital resources. So that's going to be the focus of my talk. I'm from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and my academic study has looked into issues around these areas for the last 10, 11 years. So my talk is based from that research evidence base as we go through. In terms of us as an academic department, well, how do we relate to museums? Well, we work with an awful lot of museums in terms of the projects that our academics do and our academic transformation scholarship. We also curate over 5 million digital objects across our 120 plus projects that we have done over the last 15, 16 years as a digital humanities department. Do you know what? We didn't measure anything about those projects until last year. So the first time we actually put a measurement in place with regard to those projects, because we thought we were reaching out to scholars. And so why would we measure page views and use of our digital resources? Because, hey, when that's not our measure of value. Our measure of value is things like citations in publications, or our measure of value is, do scholars get a lot out of it? You know, do they engage with materials and those aspects? So last year we actually put in place, the measures were always there. We always had the Google Analytics. We just hadn't looked at them. So when we gathered them together because we needed to demonstrate to government what we were doing, we discovered that our 5 million objects had been viewed 200 million times in 5 years. So that's page views on digital objects. That's not page views on the websites. That was digital objects being viewed and accessed. Now, this is not to give you the impression that we're wildly successful and important. It's to give you an impression of scale. And that is all. And also for me to make the point that 200 million views is not the same as impact. And I'm going to try and argue that as we go through along these lines. So my evidence base. So I started out looking at charging models and rights strategy for images in museums, starting off with a study in Europe and the UK, and then the Mellon funded me to look at art museums in the US. And this study has had a fairly catalytic effect in enabling a number of institutions like the National Gallery, etc., here in the US and other institutions elsewhere in the world, to ask themselves some fundamental questions about why are they charging for access to digital images from their museum collections, and wouldn't it be great if actually they could go with an open content strategy and just make them freely available, because frankly they're not losing any money. And so what this evidence base did, this first study that actually looked into actual behaviors and actual activity base, was that it kind of weaponized the ideas that people had. They wanted to make stuff available. They wanted it to be freely accessible for people on the web. They felt that this was a public content that should be available. But they didn't have the ammunition, and this provided some of that ammunition. A more recent study was commissioned by a UK government agency called JISC, which looked into the value and benefits of digitized resources for learning, teaching, research, and enjoyment. Remember that enjoyment word. Across the public sphere in the UK. And so what we were assessing there was that about £100 million had been spent over 15 years on digitization programs in the UK. And I was sent out to find out what were the benefits and value of that, and how great was that. Again, all of these reports are freely available on the web, so please go and access them and use them. By the way, this presentation is already on SlideShare for you as well, so if you want to access it, I've just tweeted about that. But the point of this study was just how hard it was to actually find any evaluation information that was different from, you gave us funding to image 100,000 things, and we imaged 120,000 things. Aren't we good? It was all about outputs. I'm going to hold questions till the end if you don't mind, otherwise, because I want to keep my flow. You know, so it was all about outputs, not outcomes. There wasn't much actually that we could find for £100 million of spend where we could show that the evaluation went beyond, didn't we do well with the money that you gave us, to showing that here's how we changed something, here's how we really changed people's lives, their life opportunity, or we added economic value, or we added scholarly value, along those lines. Those things are there, and actually if you look at the report you'll see there's lots of ways of demonstrating that those things happened. But there wasn't really much of an intention to measure them. And also you had this sort of funding program. You've probably had this as well, isn't it? Which is you've got a 1-year project or a 2-year project, and the aim of that 2-year project was, at the end of it, they say, right, you've got 3 weeks at the end to evaluate your impact. And that was what was happening here. And so you were looking at projects which have been very successful. You could look at examples we could talk about. But because their funding had run out, the project continued, the resource was still available, it'd been maintained over a period of time, but for the last 5 years, no one had actually looked at it and said, is it doing what it set out to do? Has it been evaluated in any way? And so there was very little information that was there. And that inspired me to my last published research in this area, which is measuring the impact of digitized resources and the balanced value impact model, which I'm going to focus on in the latter half of this talk. And this was funded by the Arcadia Fund, and again is freely available online. And what the idea of this is really to give you a way of thinking about the problem of evaluation, of deciding what is valuable and impactful in your organizations, and helping you think about that. So that's what we're going to focus on. So to bring some experience from Europe to bear, Peter Gorgels gave a keynote at the National Digital Forum last year in New Zealand, and he talked about the Rijksmuseum and the way that they have, as it says here, 125,000 artworks available in high resolution, and literally anything you want, you can do with it. I think my favorite quote is from the director of the Rijksmuseum, who said, "I don't care if you want to print our images on toilet paper, at least I'll know it's the right image and it will be of high quality." They are literally allowing a very, very open access model to their content. But Peter was saying that the result of this is that, so now we can say, I love Rice. The Rice Museum was a very dull, traditional museum, and now we can proudly say, I love Rice. So if you think about impact, then maybe love is the biggest impact. And he was making a point here that brand recognition, understanding of the purpose of the museum, its place in society, all of these things were important measures of the value of what they were doing along that way. Now, I know that you might be sat there thinking, well, that's very good, it's all very European and fun, and I like the fact that you've got government funding for things like this. But, I'm not going to be able to convince my organisation to go with this material because we just can't afford it. We will lose loads of money hand over fist. Well, let's have a look at the stats. So one of the things that I am is I'm chair of the Europeana Impact Task Force, and they did a study democratizing the Rijksmuseum. Why did the Rijksmuseum make available the highest quality material without restrictions? And what you're seeing here is the revenue from image sales in the Rijksmuseum in the years 2010, 2011, 2012. Now, 2010 is a year when no images were available, freely available on the web. So their income there is just under 125,000 euros. That's right, isn't it? 125,000, isn't it? Yeah. I'm just checking my maths. They started the process of releasing images freely available in 2011. And you can see that there's an immediate effect of their image rights and revenues actually increasing, even though there was only maybe about 6 months there where they made their materials freely available. And then 2012, which is rather a different situation. You're looking at almost a doubling of income in relationship to these 125,000 images being freely available on the web for people to use. So, there's a weapon for your armory. If you want to make the claim, if someone's saying to you, well, the Rijksmuseum, that's great, but where's the money? There is some money there. Now, the fact of the matter is, and this is one of the points I always want to make clear, is this is an insignificant amount of money in comparison to the cost of running this museum. No one is going to run their museum on the basis of rights income. So why do we get so carried away with worrying about rights income? Worrying about whether we can make $100,000 or $110,000, or whether we can make $6,000, or as many museums I go to and meet, their rights income is in the region of $20,000 or $30,000, when vast majority of their income comes from other sources. People's engagement with the museum is much more important and valuable to the museum than this income. Because it raises your brand, it raises awareness of the existence of the museum, brings more people to your shop, brings more people to your cafe, where you do make significant amounts of money, brings more people to your special exhibitions. So just look at the Rijksmuseum stuff there. So how can you make a convincing argument that you are making a difference? And so I introduced a new way, the balanced value impact model, which allows you to sort of ask that question of what do I want to assess, why do I want to assess that, and most importantly, what will I do when I get the results? Because frankly, there's no point doing any sort of evaluation or impact assessment if you do not know what you want to do with the results that you're going to get out the other end. If you don't have a purpose in gathering the information, it's going to be very difficult for you to focus in such a way that you can actually gather appropriate information. Now, this is based on a feedback loop of thinking about context, analysis and design, implementation, outcomes and results, and then what are you going to do with those? Well, you're going to review them, you're going to respond. It brings you within the feedback loop. And I'm going to focus mainly on the context bit at this moment in time, because it's really about how do you think yourself into the space of making decisions in these areas. So what is impact? Now, a lot of organizations think that impact is we put on an exhibition and 20,000 people came. Or they think we made a digital resource and 2 million people looked at it. No, those are outputs or outcomes of your activity. They are not the same as impact. Impact is actually a very exacting measure of change. What has changed and how? The measurable, what I use for balanced value impact model is the measurable outcomes arising from the existence of a digital resource that demonstrate a change in the life or life opportunities of the community. Now that's a very exacting measure, as others may not go quite that far. But if you're aiming for that sort of measure, gives you the better opportunity of achieving that. So why would this be a useful thing to engage with? Well, it's about making a case, isn't it? So if you can imagine, what I've done within the model is I've looked at wanting to mix and match 4 perspectives. Because I think any one of these perspectives on their own is a weak argument, even the economic one. And so you'll see museums engaging in different types of valuations of their activities, maybe trying to make some sort of contingent valuation measurement, or engaging with the value of their economic footprint in their community and those sorts of things. But I think on their own, those sorts of measures are not adequate. And also because when you're dealing with a digital resource, one of the problems that you've got is that it's great. You've got large numbers, but the meaningfulness of those large numbers is harder to assess because your audience is more diffuse. You can't even watch them as they come through your door and make assessments on the basis of, gender or ethnicity, which you can, to a certain extent, you can do observational studies. You don't even have that level of information available to you automatically just because someone's clicked through your website. So there are benefits in having access to digital information, that you are likely to get larger numbers, and that those numbers are likely to tell you that there are lots of people looking at your stuff, but you actually know less about the people who are clicking on your resources than you do about the people or potentially than you do about the people who walk through the door of your museum. So for me, I think it's about balancing 4 perspectives: an internal impact, an innovation, an economic, and a social impact. So if we can make this argument to say that we as an institution are more effective and efficient in delivering change and tangible benefits, we've achieved an internal impact, showing that we are a better organization, and that our organization is gaining strategic advantage through the innovation inherent in this digital activity. So we are innovating, we're doing new things that we couldn't have done without this digital activity. That these are good internal measures of success for us as an organization. And then we can look outside our organization to our communities and show that we are delivering a strong economic benefit to our community in one way or another that demonstrate the worth and value of our endeavors in clear monetary terms. We can show an economic impact. And if that community has been changed by the resource in beneficial ways that can be clearly identified, then we've achieved a social impact. So if we put these 4 perspectives together and look at measuring those, that when we're engaging with a digital resource, that will allow us to have a more balanced sense of impact. There's a reason for this being useful and interesting, and that is the British Library made available their Codex Sinaiticus. And it had 20 million views over a period of about 3 months. And they claimed that this was a massive impact, a great change in community engagement with their resources. And I put this to a friend who's an economic impact assessor, and he said, very tongue-in-cheek, this is supposed to be a joke in a sense, he said, well, they can claim that economic impact. He said, but what they haven't done is they've overclaimed. They've made too much of a claim that they've saved the country all this money. He said, because basically you could actually show a measurable dip in our gross domestic product. Because while those people were looking at the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest Bible in the world, online, they weren't shopping. And so the point here is that our impacts will interlock with each other. And so if we make a claim on just one of these measures, it can get knocked down. The other thing to say is that we will never be able to compete with the commercial entities out there who are information, knowledge, and entertainment providers. So I can talk about my 200 million hits at Department of Digital Humanities as long as I like. I know I was talking to one of the museums who said that they'd reached their 1 millionth download of open content images. there are 8 person-years worth of content being uploaded to YouTube every day. There are more images being uploaded to Facebook every week than the totality of analog photography in existence. We are not going to be able to make the claim that our usage is in that bracket. But what we can do is we can make the claim that the values that we bring to this are of a greater significance and importance because we actually do change things for people. I often say to my colleagues, have you not realized that you as an educator, us as scholars, we're in the business of changing people's lives. They come to us for a degree, a master's or a PhD. They're trying to change their lives. We actually are doing this activity. So what we want to do is we want to take those perspectives and then we want to make some choices. So this is part of you making a choice in terms of your institution. Is which values do you want to explore in relationship to your digital resources online and against those perspectives? And I'll give you an example in a moment about how that works. So there's 5 values that we can apply. You could add a 6th value of entertainment if you wanted to. There are other values that exist. These are the 5 core values that I think exist for cultural resources online. The utility value of, I'm glad it's here, I'm using it. It's the value that comes from direct use of a resource. But as we already know, there are uses and values that people have which extend beyond just something being used. People value the existence of a resource or the prestige of that resource being there, even if they don't personally use it. You know, anytime you try and close a museum or a library, the community will rise up and people will say, well, we're closing it because you're not using it. They say, well, I don't care whether I use it or not. I care that it's there. That aspect of prestige or existence. Education value, learning new things. Community values, sense of place, sense of community, sense of belonging. Or inheritance bequest value. We inherit culture objects, materials from the past. We bequeath those into future generations. And people actually value that quite a lot. It's one of the main things when you say, why is a museum valued by public? They'll say, for future generations, for our children, for those generations. So what you do is you go through a choosing process. Even if all you do at this point, you will learn an awful lot about your organization. I've done this with a couple of museums where they've had maybe a bit of an argument with their trustees about what their digital strategy should be. Because the trustees keep asking the question, how much will it cost? How much will it cost? Rather than, what's the value to my museum? And we sit them down and we work them through this value process and we get everyone to rank these from 1 to 5. 1 being the most relevant, 5 being not so interested. It doesn't mean that none of these values aren't worthwhile. And in one organization, what we found was that everyone agreed on, had education in their number 1 or 2 slot in terms of the values for that museum, whether they were a trustee or whether they were a curator. But when we looked at what was in the 1 and 2 slots for the curators, they all put inheritance bequest in their 1 and 2 slots, and all the trustees put inheritance bequest in their 4 or 5 slot. And that allowed us to move the conversation on, because then we could say, this is what we all agree on, and here's why we disagree on inheritance bequest, because that's why you employ us. That's what we're here for. We're curators. That's our job. So surely we're going to put that up high. And trustees, you're all about use, so I can understand why you put utility high. So it allows for a better conversation about your areas. But here's an example. I mean, I'm using the Wellcome Library here, which is a major library of medical science and medical history in the UK, on the basis that they've been applying the model and they're the furthest through. So what they did was they looked at their perspectives, those 4 things, social, innovation, internal, and economic, and they said, which value drivers? Because the idea is you're not supposed to measure all 5 values against every perspective. You just be here until, the next millennium. You have to make choices. But they said we wanted to do social value, utility and community, innovation the same, internal values, education, inheritance, and economic utility. So what this demonstrates is for this institution, this is why every institution who applies the balanced value impact model will have a different table at this point. It's the values that work for your institution, for your stakeholders, for your ecosystem. So it's a strategic emphasis towards measuring active use and community benefits. a desire to measure value for money, but not to overemphasize the economic element compared to other priorities. The Wellcome is a very rich organization. They don't have to justify that they are making money. They have to justify that they're spending it wisely. They wanted to measure how they had grown in skills and capacities and delivered on institutional mission. So thus you see this focus on education and inheritance bequests for the internal perspective. Have we grown in skills? Have we achieved our institutional mission? So this is just a simple example of how you get from a perspective through a value to a decision set. And then the other thing you're going to need to put into your mix is understanding your stakeholders and thinking about your digital ecosystem. So for instance, when we looked at the digital ecosystem for Europeana, it was quite difficult because you've got a mix of libraries, museums and archives who are all submitting content to this central entity called Europeana, but actually Europeana kind of exists as a cloud of all those members and all their content. It was very hard to say where the edge of Europeana ended and the beginning of the members started. And so who could claim which impact in that context? So you're going to need to understand your world as a digital resource, which is a mix of content, users, stakeholders, payment mechanisms, frameworks for legal and technological platforms and links to other resources, and how those things fit together, because that will also define how you can measure what you measure and what sort of measurements you want to put in place. Because you can imagine if you're a profit-making organization, you're going to be interested in different types of measures than you are if you're a purely public service-based organization. So there's a range of things here. And thinking about your stakeholders, who are you trying to reach? One of the things that I often see, particularly in the digital domain, is a complete ignoring of minorities. So ignoring of people who have visual difficulties, ignoring of people who don't speak your language, ignoring people who maybe have trouble engaging with your content. But these are the very communities that you can have the biggest impact with, that only you can reach out to and maybe give something to. And so you can make a more demonstrable change in their lives than you can in your average white middle class user who is going to just come surfing into your website just like they surf through everyone else's. So think about your stakeholders in that context. So at the end of the day, it's about values. And one of the sort of key values that you're going to think about here, you can see I'm at the end of a conference thinking, let's go have a drink, is the value in the wine, the glass of the drinking. So in terms of your institutions, if the wine is your content, the glass is your infrastructure for delivering that content, and the drinking is the access mechanisms, you can see how your institution is set up would give you a different set of values for how that works. If you're Twitter, you don't care about the value of the wine. It's not about fine wines. It's about having as much wine as possible that is being drunk by as many people as possible. It's binge drinking as much as possible. You know, Twitter isn't set up to only curate fine wines. It's set up to just curate loads of wine as much as possible. That's all I have a drink. Ooh, like this. Your institution may be interested in curating fine wines, and that may be where your focus is. And the infrastructure is about storing and managing and curating those fine wines. And access, yes, it's important, but it's not as important as storing and curating those fine wines. And that might be something you need to accept and understand, that the balance in your organization is not going to be the same as the big corporate players. But also, you've got fine wine. They don't. So think about your values, think about the balance of those values along the way. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much. Thanks to Alice Maggs for the illustrations. As I say, it's already on SlideShare, and you can find me on Twitter if you need to get in touch. There was a question over there which I made you hold on to, but there may also be questions for everyone. So shall we just have a group question thing?
So, do you want to stand up?
So first, I want to say that it was very insightful, and I'm happy that you delayed my question. But two questions. One, it's really just an observation. There are so many digitization efforts. I didn't see any effort to make sure that there is no duplication of effort. So maybe under this 100 millions or whatever, many different organizations are digitizing similar information, but this was less important. The question really is, when you talk about values and impact, this is not easily measurable in terms of numbers. It's like more like fuzzy. So what is your approach for really measuring the value and the impact?
Yeah, if you go and look at the report, you'll see that it looks like it's a rather large report. That's because the back end has about 60 pages of data gathering methods and links out into different data gathering methods, because in some of these measures you're going to be making quantitative measures, in other ones it's going to be qualitative. So for instance, the National Library of Wales, we peer reviewed this and we looked at how would they measure, for instance, economic value. And they said, well, we can measure from their newspaper archives. They've made available 2 million pages of newspaper. And so what they did was they said, well, the National Library of Wales is in a remote location. It's a 6-hour train journey from London, just to give you an idea of its remoteness. What we can measure, though, is we've got 20 years worth of data of people who've come and accessed the newspaper collection over 20 years. And we know, because we've got their user information, we know where they came from. And we can work out a cost per mile for them travelling to the National Library of Wales and over 20 years maybe accessing the newspaper collection 250, 300,000 times. And so we can give a sort of a cost that it was costing those users to access that material. And then we can put in place another cost measure, which is how much is it costing people to access the resources, where we're now getting 200,000 hits a month. And if you like, the sort of value that relates back to those individuals who would have otherwise come. That's a purely quantitative measure. It isn't enough in its own right. If that was our only measure, like I say, if you just go for economic measures and that's it, then it can be easily knocked down. But then you start putting that together with the qualitative measures of showing that the resources were starting to be used in schools, and the way that those resources were then linking to people's sense of place, sense of nationhood, understanding of being a Welsh person, improvements in Welsh language skills and Welsh language speaking. Then you can start to layer that together with the economic argument, and they start to look like a more powerful thing. So within all of these, you're looking for indicators which will be useful indicators, which conform to that sort of smart indicator activity. And it will be a hybrid. It will not just be quantitative and it will not just be qualitative. There needs to be a mix of them. And it will also take time. This isn't something that's going to just be okay, we'll take 2 months out and do measurements and we've got it done. It's going to, some of the measures at the Wellcome, for instance, will happen over a period of 2-3 years. It won't cost them very much money because they're kind of passive measures. So they just put the instrument in place and it just gathers the data over that period of time. But it won't come to fruition or maturity until after a sort of 2-year period. So that's the other thing to think about, is that this isn't an instant win, an instant fix. Some bits will be instant fixes. The Wellcome have already been able to measure that they've got a 2,000 times heavier use of their online archive materials than they have of their physical archive. So you get some instant hits, but you're going to also get some longer term information. It's very much as Carlos was saying, in terms of, are we asking good questions and putting the measures in place so that we have that information to support us as we go on.
My question is also to you, Simon. Thanks for the presentation. I've actually been looking forward to an opportunity to ask you a few questions. Yeah. So I'll just ask one. Although I get how the model works, what for me is the most interesting challenge, I'm involved in an initiative in the Netherlands to start measuring the impact of open data and open content in the cultural sector. And for me, there's a risk of a sort of navel gazing when you're starting with the infrastructure that an institution puts into place itself, because I think the actual value creation is often without of the context and the grasp even of the institutions nowadays. And I think that's actually where the actual big numbers might be. And we often don't really have grasp on that. Like for instance, a lot of reuse is happening within the Wikimedia environment, and there are actually some tools that you can utilize there. But how do we do that, for instance, within other environments, like, as you mentioned, YouTube, social media? It's just so fluent.
I think that's a good point. It's one of the reasons I've been really interested in Trilce's research as well, because she's been looking at sort of big economic drivers as well as the sort of more intimate information in terms of how museums engage with those areas. And we have to be aware that there are going to be economic drivers which are bigger than anything we can do in that context. It's also worth saying this is not a grand unified theory of evaluation or impact assessment. What I was frustrated with was I was seeing a lot of toolkits being developed, and it would say, here's how you do web analytics, or here's how you do this. And what I felt was missing was it was a bit like, you know, here's my vehicle. Let's open up the hood and look at the engine. Here's a toolkit, and I'm sat there going, yeah, but I don't know which bit of the engine I want to fix. I don't know which bit I need to do anything to. You've given me a spanner. I don't know how to use a spanner. So what I was trying to do with the balanced value impact model was give institutions, if you like, a bit more of a recipe or a menu for how to use the tools, a bit more of a manual to do those things. What's very clear to me is that there are a whole range of measurements that can be made, a whole different ways of measuring things. Part of the process is going to be deciding what we can feasibly measure, because some of this, you may go through the initial parts of the process and just decide, well, I'd like to know that, but I just can't afford the money to know that, or I can't afford the time to know that. There is also another problem with this, which I'll freely admit, which is this is a institutionally focused mechanism. And I actually have a PhD student who's working with me at the moment, Laura Gibson, who is looking at how do you create a more democratized approach for museums to engage with communities in South Africa, such that those communities are actually making the choices which will have the most impact on them. And so she's engaging with issues around indigenous peoples, around issues of gender, which are generally the two groups who've been most oppressed in South Africa, and trying to put in place a framework which would allow if you like, a bottom-up approach to this activity. So I have made some choices which are to do with feasibility and achievability of this activity. So I wouldn't pretend it's everything. I would say that I would say that I'm a big admirer of the theory of change as a model for social engagement for museums with their communities, and I would point to that as being a potential winner in this sphere. But the quantitative data, I think, from places like YouTube, I've had students who've done dissertations who've done very, very good quantitative data from there. In terms of scraping I was going to say emotional data. That's not what I mean. Sentiment analysis is what I meant. And using that as indicators with all the caveats that come with that, but also doing analyses of the way that museums present themselves on YouTube. You know, there are lots of different ways of measuring those things. The issue is whether you will get something at the other end that someone who's in a governmental position or in a decision-making position would think is a significant result. And maybe Carlos would like to comment about that from IMLS's perspective of how do you match make your processes of measurement and evaluation so that they do actually meet with some governmental measure in some way.
Thank you.
So you passed on a difficult question to me? Is that
Yep.
what you've done, Sam? So we're right now rethinking the way in which our reporting structure is set up for IMLS, because we've supported a number of digitization efforts, we've supported a number of infrastructure building efforts, but we've never invited folks to, first of all, within the U.S. context, there's a bias toward looking at the impact of an individual project instead of thinking in a networked way. That's the first most serious problem given the world we live in. And so now we're thinking about gathering information. We're trying to gather information using network analysis tools and looking at the way in which projects span over time across institutional boundaries. And so we're really looking forward to a day where the reports that we get in, yes, they reference the institution, the staff. We're, as a public agency, there's going to be all of those accountability measures that are necessary. But then we're looking for the information where we can follow the long tail of projects, which is something that we just haven't really embedded into the reporting structure. And so it won't be me evaluating what happened with a project that was funded during my tenure. It'll be someone who follows me. But if we embed the markers in that data, in the project data, then it'll be easier to track it. Yeah. And and that's one of the things that we're just now getting around to doing, is asking them to embed markers that identify, some of where funds are initiated, whether it's the grant ID, it's basic markers of at the inception of projects, in hopes that they're persistent over time. Yeah, I think so.
So thank you for coming. I think we have this wonderful, this reception at the end, and you know the presenters, so you're welcome to contact them via Twitter, via outside. I thank you, everybody, and yes, so hopefully till next MCN. Thank you.